The day has come. The video that you first asked for and then violently demanded is now in front of you. And today, History One Channel will live one day in the shoes of a real damn Viking. You will finally learn who they really were. Warliking, dirty barbarians, as Western culture likes to paint them, or romantic adventurers with rich traditions and cutting-edge technologies. Traditionally, we will analyze a couple of myths, debunk 2 or 3 legends, all while sharing facts which will give you goosebumps. Did you know that the Vikings discovered America 500 years before Columbus? Things we'll tell in the next couple of minutes are even more interesting. Stay tuned. Meet our guest, Gylfi Sigurdsson. The year is 844, and our handsome lad is gazing at a beautiful view of a small Scandinavian village on the outskirts of Hedeby, which is geographically located in modern Germany, not far from the border with Denmark. Yes, you heard it right. When talking about Vikings, modern people immediately think of Norway, or at least about Sweden. However, Denmark has all the right to be called the motherland of the Vikings, and the city of Hedeby, near which our Gylfi lives, was one of the 3 main Viking cities that appeared in all sorts of tales. The other 2 were located in Norway and Sweden, but Finland does not have anything to do with the Vikings. Now, same as before, these guys were an independent state. Occasionally, the Vikings pillaged it and even settled there, but no more. And before we start, let's define who are considered the Vikings. In the narrow sense, Vikings are sea bandits who were active between the 8th and 11th century AD and raided countries all around the world. This is not an exaggeration, for it is documented that the Vikings visited Persia and Africa on one side of the globe and the New World on the other. In the broader sense, the Vikings are people who lived in Scandinavia, had their own states and a complex structure. This was not a united empire like the Roman one. Baltic Slavs, who executed sea raids, are also considered Vikings. So the word Viking is, in a sense, a collective word for people who led a similar lifestyle. The word Viking itself comes from the Norwegian language, and scientists are still struggling with its interpretation, coming up with various theories. At the same time, in Russia, they were called Varangians. Latin sources called Vikings Normans, and in England, for example, they didn't seem to care at all and called the people who resembled Vikings Danes. Ironically, modern DNA tests show that the ancient Vikings were genetically closer to the inhabitants of Central Europe and Northern Russia. But these studies are new and can be proven to be wrong. So let's talk about the things that are known for sure. For example, the name of our guy, Gylfi Sigurdsson. It's no secret that the Vikings were very religious people, even if by our standards, their religion was peculiar. We'll talk about Odin and Thor later. For now, we'll focus on names. All over the world, children were often named after the gods. It was not uncommon to meet a girl named Thora, a boy named Ragnar, or even Thorbradner. The name Inga deserves a special mention. It dates back to the same era and is still widely used. Our Gylfi is named after the sea god. Also in the future, the same name will be given to the mythical king of the Vikings who met with Odin himself. The meaning of the name Sigurdsson is not as interesting. All it means is that Gylfi's father was named Sigurd. Have you watched Marvel movies? There, Thor's last name is Odinson. Scandinavians were not very creative in terms of names and just added the ending son to the father's name and got a surname. It's funny that in modern Iceland, the tradition has been preserved, and the country's football team can seem funny to some people. Daughters, in turn, got the ending dottir, which also led to some funny names. The naming convention is designed to make it easier to identify a person's belonging to the family. For the Vikings' family and their bloodline were the most important things. Our Gylfi was hardly distinguishable from an ordinary medieval farmer. The only difference was that the land on which he worked belonged to him. This was fixed by law, and even in the event of bankruptcy, it was impossible to sell land to someone. If Gylfi's family goes broke, they must first offer a relative to buy from them. This was one of the things that stopped Vikings from becoming like feudal Europe. Most often, the Vikings settled with their families and lived together for several generations. In this case, a long wooden house was built. It was divided into rooms, and the family came together at the fireplace for cooking or gatherings. The rest of the time, a Viking's life is pretty boring. Sheep, barley, and oats. All members of the family were busy growing and keeping an eye on the goods in order to somehow survive. After all, we are talking about the Northern Territories. It is almost impossible to grow wheat there. Right now, only 3% of Norway's land is suitable for growing anything. In Sweden, this is 9%, and in Iceland, about 1%. These numbers alone are enough to understand the reason why Vikings so fiercely attacked everything that moved. The answer to the question of why this was done by sea also lies in geography. Scandinavia is not a very friendly place. Mountains, fjords, and undesirable land created a historical phenomenon. It was much easier for our Gylfi to get on a boat and sail to Uncle Bjorn in a nearby village than to walk the distance. If Roman merchants had flashbacks of pirates and fear of drowning every time they saw a ship, the Vikings had the opposite feelings. Climbing rocks is a much more time-consuming process than calm sailing on a ship, and any self-respecting family had a boat or at least kept in touch with someone who had one. Otherwise, the Scandinavians could not survive. Here lies our first myth born from TV series and Christian propaganda. In the series The Vikings, we can often see how the Scandinavians chop each other into pieces left and right. This is a blatant lie. While it is true that there were no clear laws in Viking communities and villages, in the vast majority of territories for unjustified murder, the least of punishments was exile. At worst, you could have followed the dead man to Odin. The second detail which the series got right, and many books didn't, was the role of women. Here, the show Vikings is holding up well, for the Scandinavian people were one of the first in history to come up with real equality in marriage contracts. Our Gylfi Sigurdsson has a fiancée, Kraka. She lives in a nearby village, and the couple is in love. But unlike in Europe, the final word was said by the woman, not the man. No matter how much money the guy has, and no matter how influential his family is, if the groom does not have an impressive biography of military campaigns and bravery behind his back, there will be no wedding. On paper, the Vikings were a patriarchy, and the final decision for the girl was made by the head of the family. But in fact, without her consent, no father or older brother would give her away. The reason is simple. A Viking's wife is not just a toy. This is a person who will monitor the family estate while the husband can spend many months and even years in raids, and simultaneously raise children into real warriors. The famous King Ragnar Lothbrok said, "I chose a mother for my sons who passed on her fearlessness to them." And this is not a figure of speech. The woman was a rightful member of society. A fragment of an ancient law survived till this day, stating that even touching the hand of a Scandinavian woman was punishable by a fine of 5 marks, and at the wedding, a prototype of a marriage contract was concluded. According to it, the groom gave the beloved a share of his estate, called a woman's gift. There was also a friendship gift that the future husband gave to the bride's father for the ransom. In turn, the father released his daughter with a dowry, and discussing the details of the wedding was like a real trade deal. As you can see, marriage was a pain for Gylfi. The situation is made even worse by the fact that youth was not a positive sign. While in Europe they married at 10, the Vikings preferred to make an alliance closer to 30. This is dictated by logic. A man who has lived to this age, by definition, has a better chance of surviving a raid than an 18-year-old youngster. Often there were delayed marriages when the young were engaged, but the official wedding happened a few years later. Note that the series Vikings showed another important detail. In the absence of husbands, women could easily lead a campaign with a sword in their hands, because Vikings were a truly equal society. Let's talk about what you've all been waiting for: raids. The year is 844, and Denmark is ruled by the aforementioned Ragnar Lothbrok, the main character of the Viking series. The series greatly exaggerated the story of Ragnar. In reality, he was not an ordinary Viking, but son of Sigurd the Ring, the last ruler of Denmark. His official title is Konungur, which translates to king by European standards. Note that we don't have reliable information about the existence of the guy, but what we do have are other historical facts. For example, the Viking seizure of Paris. In short, the basics of every raid were the same. Our Gylfi is minding his own business raising sheep and meets a messenger from another village who is inviting people to go on a raid. Gylfi, along with other skillful villagers, gathers, loads the ship, and follows the ruler. If the raid is relatively small, Gylfi himself can lead it. But in our case, we are talking about a large-scale Viking invasion of France. Back then, a town invasion wasn't that big of a surprise. Back in 789, the Vikings attacked the city of Dorset in England, successfully looting it. In 800, the Vikings conquered the Shetland Islands, and in 844, pillaged the Portuguese capital, Lisbon. People of Europe got used to such raids, and unfortunately, this is not a myth. Christian propaganda didn't tarnish the Vikings' reputation. Norsemen did burn entire villages down, emptying them to the last grain. In Latin, there was even a common prayer that began with the words, "Save us, Lord, from the wrath of the savage Norman people who dwell in the north." When Europeans saw Viking ships on the horizon, they would pray and prepare for battle. There is a theory that we should thank the Vikings for the development of countries the way we view them today. After the fall of Rome, Europe turned into chaos, but in the face of the Scandinavian threat, the rulers structured life, logistics, and protection of villages, all to be safe from Vikings. But let's go back to the 845. Gylfi Sigurdsson, along with a couple of thousand soldiers led by Ragnar Lothbrok, marches to Paris. And before we begin, let's debunk a couple of stereotypes. The main being that Vikings were untrained barbarians who behaved like robbers. In 50% of cases, this was indeed true, but only in 50, because the Vikings had good tactics. It was no accident that they managed to kick the butts of the British, French, and other regular armies. King Ragnar kept an entire spy service for intelligence purposes, and he also introduced the rule among Vikings to not burn villages, but instead to take a ransom. The logic was simple. In this case, in a couple of years, you can return to the same place and earn money again. A similar plan was reserved for Paris, where the Vikings are headed. It's no accident we chose as an example an event from the show, because the series showed it incorrectly. There, the Vikings staged a fake death of their leader Ragnar, and under the guise of a funeral procession entered Paris. A similar situation has actually occurred in history, only in reality, the Vikings were capturing not Paris, but Rome, and the story seems more like a joke. This was after Ragnar's death, and the Vikings were ruled by his son, Bjorn Ironside. Wanting to outshine his father in his seizure of Paris, the son decided to conquer the richest city of that time, Rome. Bjorn assembled 62 ships, landed in Italy, and pretended to be dead. His associates made up a story that before his death, the Viking leader decided to convert to Christianity. As a result, the funeral procession was allowed into the city, and the living Bjorn jumped out of the coffin, opened the gate from the inside, and the city was seized. So what's so funny? You see, the Vikings messed up and captured not Rome, but the Italian city Luna. As for Paris, it was seized in a more classical way. Old Ragnar was a great strategist, and the spies brought him news of an uprising in France, when 3 groups were fighting for power at once. As a result, the Viking army, which approached the city, was opposed by scattered detachments of the French, who were killed with the help of an elegant tactical maneuver. The Vikings did not even enter the city itself. King Charles the Bald shit his pants at just the sight of the Vikings, and preferred to pay Ragnar an insane amount of money as a ransom. In the end, our Gylfi sailed home on a ship full of gold, and along the way, Ragnar's army burned all the French towns. There was no ransom paid for them. Sometimes, the guys started full-on sieges, waiting for the cities to run out of supplies until the exhausted from war town couldn't fight back any longer. Norsemen also liked to attack Christians on holidays, when they were resting or attending church services. That's how they captured Luna, which we talked about earlier. So as you can see, the myth of the barbarian nature of the Vikings is just a myth. Without planning and strategy, they would not have conquered half of Europe. Another common myth is the lack of hygiene among Vikings. Christian propaganda painted them as unwashed and smelly. Because of this, the popular series is criticized, since Scandinavians there look like top models. While that certainly wasn't true, Vikings had alright hygiene. Our Gylfi even had a special beard brush. A bunch of those are found around at the sites of excavations. A 13th century English chronicler named John even envied the Vikings in his notes. According to him, they easily seduced English women because they were neat, combed, and washed every Saturday. For medieval Europe, this was unheard of. We talked about dysentery on that continent in our Plague Doctor video. However, there is a mini slip-up in the series. Ragnar Lothbrok is shaved to the point that he looks like a billiard ball. Real Vikings would have named the guy Ragnar the Bald and made fun of him. After all, only criminals or captured slaves were shaved bald, while the Vikings should rock combed hair. So what's waiting ahead for our Gylfi? Ahead of him is a second trip to France, which was less successful. Half of the troops died of dysentery, and it was not possible to capture Paris again. What was possible is to colonize Iceland and Greenland. There is documentary evidence of Viking settlements on these lands, and a little later, in the year 1000, Leif Erikson landed in Newfoundland, which is located in modern Canada. After sailing around Greenland, the Vikings landed in North America long before Columbus, as evidenced in the saga of Eric the Red. There is much more to tell about our Gylfi's life. The Vikings, for example, adored cats, which were hated in Europe. The church in the Middle Ages even burned these woolen creatures, and the Scandinavians, on the contrary, cherished and fed them. Also, ordinary hard workers worshipped Thor more than Odin, and did not wear any helmets with horns. These helmets were made up in 1876 for a theatrical production, and the Vikings didn't even like leather, preferring clothes made of wool and linen. Many stereotypes were created about the Scandinavians. In reality, they had developed both crafts and aesthetics along with blacksmithing. We can tell you a lot more about this, but unfortunately, it would take way longer than our standard video. So if you want to see part 2 about old pal Gylfi Sigurdsson, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and we will gladly continue this topic. But for now, that's all we got. See you later, friends!